What is the Overton window and how does our church close it? That's the question I'll be answering in this video. Hello everyone, this is Dr. Todd, and I've been thinking about the current state of our culture and how we got into the mess that we find ourselves in. As I was working through our present predicament, I came across a concept that I think is important for us to understand as Christians. Have you ever wondered how things that used to be totally unthinkable have now become a matter of law or public policy? Well, that process explains what is known as the Overton window. In this video, I'm going to explain what the Overton window is, how it works, and what we need to do about it as Christians. First, let's answer the question, what is this thing we call the Overton window? Well, Overton's window is a concept that comes from the discipline of political science. It explains the course that a radical view takes on its way to becoming implemented as public policy. Here's kind of the pathway, and I'll show this on the screen. There's a pathway that ideas follow that end up from them being what we call unthinkable to being sometimes encapsulated in law, or at least public policy. And they go from being unthinkable to radical, to acceptable, to sensible, to popular, and then finally down into policy. Now, you may think as you listen to that, and I can give you some examples as we go along, but you may think that politicians manipulate the window. Well, in reality, they usually don't manipulate it too much, but what they do is they're very good at reading it correctly and then aligning their proposals or their policies to match whether or not it's in the window. Because if they speak too much outside the window, it really virtually becomes political suicide. So they're very good at testing the wind, if you will, seeing what the climate is or which way the wind's blowing, and then they develop policies in accordance to that will help them get reelected, quite frankly. Another way that they use the window would be to throw something totally radical out there for people to consider, with no hopes of it ever being accepted. But human nature is such as when somebody enters into a discourse about a certain issue, you throw out something really radical, hoping that it'll stick, but not expecting it to. Well, the other individual who wants to be seen as a good person will then meet you halfway. So what ends up happening is your opponent moves towards your position, even though you knew from the beginning that your radical proposal was not really what you wanted. But you've actually won the day because you've got them to move over toward your side a little further. And this is what happens. So things can slowly move from at least unthinkable to being acceptable. And you can think of several things, even in my lifetime. When we think of something like gay rights was a perfect example. When I was a youngster, many homosexual acts were considered illegal in many states. And now, the government is kind of in one of these situations where they can either prohibit a behavior, permit a behavior, or promote a behavior. And in my short life, relatively speaking, I've seen the situation of homosexuality from a Christian perspective go from something that was prohibited to something that's promoted and exalted as such a wonderful, heroic thing. And so that's how these kind of things come into being. Well, how then does Overton's window work? If we kind of see what it is now, how does it work? Well, to move Overton's window, or to move an idea through down into the center of Overton's window, if you will, or get it into Overton's window. There are usually three things that need to happen. Any three of these things can happen, or a combination. The first, Overton's window moves a lot of times by crisis. When we see something like a 9/11 occur, and now with 9/11, a crisis such as that, there's the Patriot Act, and then all of a sudden, things that we never would have dreamed being acceptable as a society, as far as limitations on our freedom in the name of keeping us safe from terrorism, have now been imposed upon us almost 20 years later. So that would be an example. A global pandemic such as the COVID virus is another example of how government can come in, and once it gets entrenched, it's hard to get them to go away. And so we see that a movement by crisis can move the window. Things that were unthinkable before the crisis occurred are now not only accepted, but they're popular, and then they're even and oftentimes made part of the law of the land. So the first thing would be a movement by crisis. The second thing would be movement by gradual persuasion. Now, this is the information campaign of a new idea. It's propaganda. Think tanks in Washington, D.C. are very popular for this. They have an idea that's right outside of, they're trying to move the window, and so they have an idea that's probably radical, not unthinkable, but radical, and they want it to gain widespread acceptance, so they start publishing papers, making things seem okay. It almost reminds me of the old metaphor of the frog being in the pot, and you slowly turn up the heat, and he boils before he realizes what's happened. And that's what happens by gradual persuasion. Once again, going back to the homosexual situation, I remember when Ellen came out of the closet in her show, and it was vastly unpopular. Well, now, and it actually even, I would argue, ended her show prematurely, probably. Well, now, every show has, I would argue, a disproportionate share of gay people on it, extolling the virtues to where we don't even pay attention to it as Christians anymore. It just seems normal. I mean, we don't want to be mean and hateful to people, so we just sort of accept things. And that's the kind of thing that happens. It's an advocacy-driven kind of research from the think tanks. It's propaganda through media and social media, and it simply moves the goalpost of what's acceptable. You see it in film and television all the time. Another thing like this would be something like the legalization of marijuana would be another example. It went from being totally illegal to, in some states now, obviously legal and a moneymaker for many governments. A third type of movement that can occur, in addition to movement by crisis or movement by gradual persuasion, would be the movement initiated by a charismatic salesman. This is an active mover who deliberately tries to move the window. Two of those kind of come to mind that I can think historically, just recent history. Ronald Reagan, when he came to office, he was very charismatic, and he saw that the tax rates were high, and almost through sheer force of his personality, he ushered in a new era of tax cuts and lower, smaller government, so on and so forth. Another example of that, as far as charisma goes, would be Barack Obama. Barack Obama has promulgated some of his policies that have been foundational to kind of the situation we're in now, but he's been very effective in charismatically getting people to go along with his agenda. So what we have to understand is, as the window moves, its borders become slightly or more rigid, and the discussion of certain subjects then becomes suppressed. Definitions of words get twisted in order to keep the discourse within that window. An example of this is our present culture. In our present culture might be something like having the audacity to claim that gender is binary and it's not socially constructed. That would be considered unacceptable speech. It would be considered hate speech to even reference biology, basic biology. And in order to keep everybody on the field or within the window, what happens is forces on the outside of that, shame, cancel, and basically throw you back in. If you're going to be in the discussion, you're not allowed to say certain things. You're not allowed to do certain research that may prove things are different than public opinion at the time. And so by doing that, it curtails free speech and thinking. That's why a socialist agenda, for instance, will never work, because in order to get it to work, you have to suppress free speech. You have to erase history, things like that. And individuals that have an interest in that happening don't want that to happen. So they keep everything contained. So you can feel like you're advocating for a Christian worldview, but you're really not. You're being limited because there's certain concepts you're not even allowed to bring up. You see, it's important to understand that public policy shapes and gives direction to our culture. And as such, Overton's window is the battlefield upon which the current culture is being fought. Well, if we know what Overton's window is and we know how it works, how then do we deal with it as Christians? Well, since we're in a battle, I guess is the best way to put it, it might be helpful to follow sound military doctrine as we engage the enemy. Now, we must remember that as Christians, though, our weapons are not of the conventional variety. So I'm in no way advocating a violent overthrow of our political system. Instead, I want to show you that we must engage the enemy on the battlefield of ideas, a battlefield whose dimensions have been determined by Overton's window. We must follow Paul's thinking in 2 Corinthians 10, 4-5, when he writes, "For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh." In other words, they're not conventional, but divinely powerful for tearing down the strongholds. What are those strongholds? Well, they're worldly philosophies that he says here, as we tear down speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. So they're world system philosophies, secular philosophies that go against the Christian worldview and take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And as such, there are 9 principles, that military principles, war principles, principles of war, that we must hold to in dealing with the battlefield of Overton's window. Now, these I obtained, they were originally adapted from a fellow named Fuller, who was a British officer in World War I. Our government or our military adapted them, and I get that from there. But the first, and I'll just go through these quickly, the first is objective. We need a clearly defined, decisive, and attainable objective. Our objective is to take back the culture for Christ. And we truly believe in the prayer, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So we have to have a definable objective, and that's to take back our culture for the glory of Jesus himself. Second, the second principle is offensive. We need to seize, retain, and exploit the initiative. It is not the time for us to hunker down in our holy huddles. We must take the fight to the enemy by engaging them on a philosophical level, with ideas, with truth, with scientific discovery, which, by the way, coheres with reality. The third principle is mass. We need to concentrate combat power at the decisive place and time. We must unify and focus on eliminating the greatest threats presented to us. I use the illustration, if we were in a foxhole in Vietnam and the Viet Cong were attacking at night, we don't shoot the guy that's 400 meters away, we shoot the guy that's right in front of us. So we need to see where they're coming in, and we need to meet them at that point and kick them out, especially at the church, if you will, or defensive structure of the church. We need to accept the fact that we're under attack and we got to face our enemies. The fourth principle is economy. We must allocate minimum essential combat power to secondary efforts. In other words, we don't need to get caught up in secondary squabbles that drain us of our ability to fight. We must simply hold the line on secondary issues for now so that we can be at full fighting capacity to confront the enemy as he is approaching us. So we don't need subversion from within. There's all kinds of implications that we can get into in other videos. The fifth principle, maneuver. We must place the enemy in a position of disadvantage through flexible application of combat power. We must keep our enemy off balance. In our discourse, we must hit, run, regroup, and hit our enemy again. And this involves being careful Christian thinkers. This involves us using biblical truth reasonably wielded for the glory of Christ. Number 6, as far as this goes, these principles of warfare is unity of command. For every objective, we must ensure unity of effort under one responsible commander. We must remember that each and every one of us, if we call ourselves Christians, are under the command of King Jesus. We must answer to Him and Him only, and we must answer to Him in one unified and strong and loud voice. The 7th principle, security. We must never permit the enemy to acquire an unexpected advantage. We must deal with those who have gotten inside our perimeter. We must insist on orthodox views based on the Bible, and within our ranks, we must make sure that everyone is holding to a biblical worldview and a understanding of truth that coheres with reality, for instance, an objective understanding of truth. Number 8, the 8th principle is surprise. We must strike the enemy at a time, place, or in a manner in which he is unprepared. We must engage our enemies in the public square. For too long, we have separated the secular from the sacred, and God never did that. That's a false dichotomy. So we must take our ideas into the marketplace of ideas, be it social media, be it wherever. And we must give an answer for the hope that lies within us with gentleness and respect. But we need to interact with these individuals on a face-to-face basis where we're not afraid of them. We have nothing to be ashamed of as Christians. We have the truth on our side, and we need to share that truth in the public marketplace. This also means that we have to participate in the political process, for instance. And the ninth principle of warfare is we must prepare clear, uncomplicated plans and clear, concise orders to ensure thorough understanding. Well, we must insist on carrying all of our activities out from the foundations of a solid, sound, biblical worldview perspective. We must simply infect the world with the gospel through our daily interactions with it. We're to love God with all our heart, mind, souls, and strength, and we love our neighbors as ourselves, and we do so as we make disciples by letting Him be known and His word be known from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. You see, if we follow these principles, we'll be able to recapture the initiative in the ongoing culture war and carry out the cultural mandate found in Genesis 1 that commands us to subdue the earth. But nothing happens if you're content to simply sit by and let the enemy storm the castle. Christian, the battle is raging. The question is, are you willing to join the fight? Well, I hope this video has been helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the section below. Also, if you like the work that I'm doing here, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification button so you won't miss out on any of my future videos. God bless. We'll talk again soon.